Hello, welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to be talking about qualitative data. This is also known as categorical data. So if it helps, go ahead and write categorical data. Okay. And so today we're going to be talking about what we do once we collect qualitative data. We're going to talk about how to organize this data. We're going to talk about how to display this data using graphs. Let's go ahead and read the learning objectives. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to organize data using frequency tables, relative frequency tables, and contingency tables. You should also be able to interpret and construct the following types of graphs: bar charts, pie charts, and side-by-side bar charts. The question here is, once you collect qualitative data, what are you going to do with the data? Okay. So we're going to mainly be focusing on graphical ways to describe and display qualitative data. So we're going to start with the most common ways of displaying qualitative data. That is using bar charts and pie charts. Before we try to create these graphs, let's go ahead and talk about how we first need to organize the qualitative data that was collected. Let's go ahead and consider a problem where we are given a list of the data that was collected. Suppose you have the following data for which type of car students at a college drive. Once you have a list of the data, you have to think about how can I organize the data. We're going to be organizing this data set using a frequency table. The frequency table is going to help us see the count of how often a data value occurs in our data set. Okay. So here below, you have a frequency table. And notice, I already started creating the frequency table. You're just going to finish completing the table that we have here. Okay. Notice, with qualitative data, we're going to have categories. In this case, we have the categories being a car brand. So notice, we have Ford, we have Chevy, Honda, Toyota, Nissan, and then there's a category called Other. Okay. And so for that category, I'm thinking perhaps in the data set, we have some data values that maybe perhaps only show up once. When we're organizing the data, we're not going to want to have a category that only has one data value within that category. Okay? And so in those cases, we create a category called Other, and we can go ahead and gather data values that were only observed once or maybe a few times in the data set. And so what is the frequency? The frequency is going to be the count for each category. Okay? And so, for example, Chevy showed up 12 times in our data set. You can go through the data set and verify this. You should be seeing Chevy showing up 12 times. Okay. Now, same thing with Toyota. You should see Toyota showing up 12 times on your data set. Okay. Nissan, you should be seeing Nissan showing up 10 times. If you're completing this frequency table, you're going to need to count the number of times you're seeing Ford on the data set. So go ahead and do that. Okay. You should find that Ford only shows up 5 times. Okay. So the frequency for that category is 5. Okay. Now go ahead and see how many times Honda shows up on your data set. You should find that Honda shows up 6 times on your data set. That means that the frequency for that category is 6. You should also see that Nissan shows up 10 times. And notice, all the other brands that are not within the first 5 categories on our table are going to be in the category Other. And so we have 5 brands that are going to be in that category. When you're creating a frequency table, you're going to have the first column be all the categories emerging from your data set. And then the second column is going to be the frequencies for each of the categories. Okay. So Now let's talk about how we create a relative frequency table. A relative frequency table is going to help us see how common a data value is relative to the rest of the data. Okay? So in this case, we're going to need to create a third column. That column is going to be titled relative frequency. If you're going to create a relative frequency table, you're going to need the frequencies first. And we already have them. That is what we did in part A. So now, how do we find the relative frequency? Okay. The relative frequency is going to be computed by taking the frequency divided by the total number of data values. Okay. So we have a total of 50 data values. You can go ahead and count them from looking at the data list. Or you can verify that when we add the frequencies, we do get 50. Okay? So if we're computing the relative frequency for the first category, we're going to take the frequency for that category, which is 5, and we're going to divide it by the total number of data values, which is 50. And so that should give you 0.10. Let's go ahead and do it for the Chevy category. We have 12 divided by 50. Again, the frequency divided by the total number of data values. You should be getting 0.24. Let's go ahead and do one more. Honda, if we want the relative frequency, we need to take 6 divided by 50, which is 0.12. Okay. I'm going to let you calculate the relative frequency for the last 3 categories. Now, one note that I want to make is that once you're done calculating the relative frequencies for all the categories, if you were to add the relative frequencies, you should be getting 1. Okay? Now, let's talk about what 0.10 represents. Well, this represents the proportion of data values that land in the 4 category. Okay? It might be helpful to convert this to a percent. So 0.10 times 100 is equal to 10%. Okay? So 10% of the data values land in the 4 category. Now, 0.24 is the proportion of data values that are in the Chevy category. Again, it might be helpful to convert this to a percentage. So 0.24 times 100, that is equal to 24%. We see that 24% of the data values are in the Chevy category. Okay, you can also do the same for the 3rd category, 0.12 times 100. This is 12%. 12% of the data values are in the Honda category. Okay, so again, the relative frequency is a proportion of data values that land within each category. And again, it might be helpful to convert this to a percentage to help you see what percent of the data values are within each category. Okay? So when we say that these relative frequencies add up to 1, we're saying they should add up to 1 times 100, which is 100%. Okay. Now that you know how to organize qualitative data using frequency tables and relative frequency tables, now we can talk about how to create a bar chart. Bar charts consist of the frequencies on one axis and the categories on the other axis. Okay. And so I should make a note here. You don't always have to use the frequencies on one of the axes. You can also use the relative frequency. You can also use the percentage for each category. It doesn't always have to be the frequency on one of the axes. Using the frequency table from exercise 1, we're going to create a bar graph. First, we're going to talk about how to create the bar graph by hand. Then you're going to need to pull out a Google Sheet because we're going to be creating the bar graph on Google Sheets. Okay, so be ready for that. You might have to stop the video once we get to that point. Okay, now what are the expectations for a bar graph? Well, you're going to need a title for the graph. You're also going to need to title the x-axis and the y-axis. Now, notice here, the x-axis is being used for the categories and the y-axis is being used for the frequency. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. You can use the x-axis for the frequency and you can use the y-axis for the categories. You have both options. Now, since we're using the x-axis for the categories, notice you're going to see each of the categories on the x-axis. Frequency, well, we need to go from 0 up to the highest frequency that we see on the frequency table. So the highest frequency that you see on the frequency table is 12. I went ahead and went up to 14 just to have some extra space on the top. We don't have to go up to 14. We can stop at 12. So notice for the category Ford, if you look back at our table, that category has a frequency of 5. Now, if we were to create the bar for the Chevy category, we would need to go up to 12. That's the frequency we're observing for that category. And so we would be creating a bar for this category. One thing to mention here is that bar graphs should have a space between each of the bars. The bars shouldn't be touching each other. Go ahead and write that. We need a space between each bar. We don't have values within both categories. They shouldn't be touching. They're not related. Data values in one category are not related to data values in another category. That's how you can remember we should have some space between each bar. Okay? You can go ahead and do this by hand and continue drawing a bar for each of the categories. For example, for Honda, we should go up to 6. That is the frequency that we have for this category. Okay. And you can continue to draw the bars for the last 3 categories. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop here because I want to show you how to do this on Google Sheets. Okay. And so for this, you're going to need to open up the Microsoft version of this activity. That's going to help us work faster. Okay, and so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go up to our frequency table and I'm going to go ahead and copy this frequency table. And so first, let me go ahead and type in a value for the first and third category. Okay, so let's go ahead and select the table. We're going to copy this table. So Control C. Now we're going to open Google Sheets. Okay. So go to google.com, go ahead and sign in. If you don't have an account, you're going to need to create an account. Okay. So once you sign in, you're going to click on Google Apps and you're going to go down until you see Sheets. Okay. Go ahead and add a new sheet. You can go ahead and give a name to the sheet. Let's just say Math and 146 section 2.1. I'm going to click on the first cell and I'm going to click on Control B. Now we have the table here on Google Sheets. The next step is to highlight both columns. Once you highlight both columns, you're going to click on Insert and you're going to go down to Chart. Okay. Now Google Sheets doesn't know what type of graph you want. It's going to give you a graph that you could use for the data set. We could use a pie chart, but we're trying to use a bar graph. Okay. So we could use this bar graph, but I'm wanting to have the categories on the x-axis. So I'm going to click on column chart. And there you have it. We have the categories on the x-axis. We have the frequency on the y-axis. Notice what is going on. We have an extra category. Google Sheets is thinking that the total is one of the categories. How are we going to fix this? Let's delete the total row. Now we only have the 6 categories that we wanted. Let's go ahead and double click on the graph. Once you double click on the graph, you're going to have options to customize the graph. Here, the only thing I'm going to be changing is I'm going to be changing the title. You should be able to double click on the title. Once you double click on the title, you're going to be able to type a new title. Just gonna go ahead and give it the title, type of graph driven by students. And we can go ahead and center the title. We can go ahead and make the title darker. Same thing with categories, same thing with the x-axis title, the y-axis title. You can go ahead and make those a little bit darker. You just have to double click on each of them. Okay. And that is all we're going to change here. You could change the color, you could play around with different settings if you want to, but I'm just gonna go ahead and stop here, okay? Now, I wanted to show you how to create this type of graph on Google Sheets, because once you have the graph on Google Sheets, you can copy and paste the graph into Microsoft, you can copy and paste it into a poster, into a PowerPoint. Okay? This is going to be a more professional display. Okay, so here on the right top corner, you have the option to click on the 3 vertical points. And here you have the option to copy the graph. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this to our notes. Here we have our graph. I'm actually going to delete the graph that we attempted to do by hand. And there we have it. Again, notice we have space between each of the columns, between each of the graphs. I'm mentioning this because we're going to look at histograms, and histograms are going to look similar to bar graphs. However, with histograms, we're not going to have space in between the columns. We're also not going to have categories. One thing to know is that there's no set order for the data values, meaning there's no set order for the categories. We could switch Ford and Chevy. We could switch Honda and Toyota. Again, there's no set order. Now I should add a remark here, and you're not going to have space. So I'm going to make sure to add this to your activity. I want to add that a bar graph where the categories on the x-axis are arranged in a specific order, and the order is usually from highest to lowest. It's called a Pareto chart. Okay. So that's just the comment that I'm going to make here. And so we could arrange the bars so that we have the categories in order from the category that has the highest frequency to the category that has the lowest frequency. But if we're just talking about a bar chart, we say it does not have to have a specific order. Okay? So now that you know how to create a bar graph, I'm interested to see if you're able to interpret the bar graph. So I have some questions here that we're going to answer. Okay, so what % of students drive a Ford? We could go back and look at the relative frequency table, but we're going to stick to looking at the graph to answer these questions. Okay, and so for the Ford category, we see that 5 out of, well, how many do we have? We know that we have 50 because we saw it on the table, but if we didn't have the table, then we would have to add the frequency. So we'd have to say 5 plus 12 plus 6 plus 12 plus 10 plus 5. That will give us 50. So by looking at the bar graph, we would be able to see that we have a total of 50 data values. And so we're trying to find the percentage of students who drive a Ford. We would say, well, let's take the frequency for this category divided by 50. this is going to give us 0.10. And as a percentage, this is 0.10 times 100, which is 10%. So that would be our final answer. Now, looking at the bar graph, can we answer the following question? What is the most frequent type of car students drive? We're asking ourselves, what category has the most frequency? When we're looking at the bar graph, we're looking for the tallest bar on our graph. And so we have Chevy and Toyota. They both have the highest frequency being 12. So we have two categories with the most frequency. Okay. So let's go ahead and write Chevy and Toyota. Okay. Now I'm gonna let you answer the last question. How many more students drive a Toyota than a Ford? Go ahead and answer that question. Remember, you are practicing how to interpret a bar graph. So look at the bar graph and answer this question.